Hello all, I'm KelKidman and welcome to Breaking on the Daily, where today we are going to begin with the border crisis because it just refuses to go away. There have been so many stories with regard to this, many headlines, every outlet is talking about it, including places like CNN, and the most prevalent thing, at least I've seen, is the absolute blame game that has been going on. Both sides have been blaming the other, and which one do you think is actually going to be right about this? The administration that just got in and immediately had this crisis the moment they got in, and has rhetoric that would potentially portend to this crisis, or the side where the administration that was on their side was in for 4 years and never had this problem, and nowhere near to the same extent. I wonder. Let's go through it. First of all, let's start with a quote by the Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro. I'm not going to pronounce his last name because I just can't. And he says, and he was speaking to ABC News about this, and he was asking, why is it especially challenging and difficult now? Because the entire system under United States law that has been in place throughout administrations of both parties was dismantled in its entirety by the Trump administration. So we are rebuilding the system as we address the needs of vulnerable children who arrive at our borders. That is his claim to fame. And I don't think this, contrary to what you'd expect from someone like me, I don't think this claim is exactly inaccurate, and we'll get to that. But let's first hear the argument from the other side. And that argument is coming from Jim Jordan. Now, to put this quote in context, because it doesn't really make sense without it, Joe Biden said, talking, hey, no, don't come in. This was a kind of walking back some of his earlier positions, saying, now is not the time to come. Do not come, that sort of stuff. That's the sort of things that the Biden administration has been moving with in recent. And Jim Jordan has responded to this by saying, when you tell basically everyone that you're going to roll out the red carpet, and then people come and start walking down the red carpet, I forget who used the metaphor, but I think it's appropriate. When that happens, and now you say what he said last night, again, I think it's not much, and it's way too late. And, well, you might expect I'm more inclined to agree with Rep. Jim Jordan. But, of course, my simple meanderings on that particular subject are not going to convince a whole lot of people. So, let's get into something that may, and that is policy. Because how dedicated is Biden to open borders and not shutting down the border, preventing people from getting through, despite the more recent rhetoric that he's done? Well, Biden is spending millions of dollars currently per day to stop border wall construction. Not on border wall construction itself, forgive me for the voice crack, but not on the actual construction of it, but on stopping it. Because, for those who aren't aware, Biden put a 60-day stoppage, or pause actually to be more accurate, on border wall construction. And this is something he did on day one. It didn't even take him 24 hours before he stopped construction on the border wall. And this is costing him millions of dollars because there are contracts currently in place that he is violating through this pause, meaning he has to pay out money to these companies that are working on the border wall in order to do this. One contract in particular, and I think this, I don't know if there are multiple, is worth $51.9 million. And if this contract gets canceled, which it may, because the pause, it doesn't say that it's going to restart after the 60 days. It's actually up to decision. That will happen after the 60 days, which just seems weird since wouldn't the 60 days be used for decision making and then you have it at the end of the 60 days? Whatever. Government policy doesn't make sense. That's just a commonality among all of time. So let's not split hairs about that. But it is still relevant because this is going to be happening, and I think the 60-day timeline is around the point where it would pass, and that decision is going to be coming soon. And so this border wall may stop getting constructed. And to be clear to all the black pillars who think for some reason that, Trump didn't build anything of the border wall, No, he was building it, and it was being built up until the day Biden was in office. There was something like 100 or so miles of border wall that was newly constructed, and much of it was actually refurbished from being a fence to a proper wall with the slats and that sort of stuff. Which, hey, that is progress on that. This policy, though, represents a tendency for Biden, because Biden doesn't want the border to be closed. As if I need to claim that. As if I need to even explicate on that. That was one of his main arguments against Trump. The fact that he liked closed borders, as opposed to Biden, who liked open borders and people just gallivanting across the border unaccompanied or without any sort of regulation whatsoever. And this is the sort of thing that pertains to the border crisis that is currently assailing us. But some people aren't even going to be convinced by policy. It's not as though this sort of policy is exactly what would lead to the sort of things that we're seeing now. But of course, there isn't just that. There's also some more personal stories, some anecdotes that we have here. Because an illegal immigrant has came to the U.S. basically, in his own words, because Biden was elected and definitely wouldn't have come under Trump. Now, if that isn't anything but the absolute vindication of Trump, I don't know what is. Now, I want to show you this clip because it is pretty funny.
Would you have tried to do this when Donald Trump was president?
Definitely not. Definitely. We had the chance, the same violence that is going on today was there last year. We used to watch the news, and I definitely won't do this.
So did you come here because Joe Biden was elected president?
Basically.
I mean, seriously, dude, how more cut and dry can you get? People are coming across the border because of Biden's rhetoric, and there's no blame shifting that is going to convince many of the American people otherwise, because the illegal immigrants aren't even convinced. At least I hope so. I haven't looked at polling with regard to this issue, but if I saw anything other than looking at this with a bit of a slant eye in this sort of excusing that is coming out of the Biden administration and much of the Democrats, I don't believe you, first of all. And second of all, I'm disappointed in the American people, assuming that that poll is accurate, which is it's a big assumption, to be fair, if that poll exists. Once again, I haven't looked at polling. I'm just making assumptions here myself, but I think they're reasonable ones. Yeah, but moving on to our next story, and this one is kind of an interesting one where I kind of disagree with the headline. Japan is maybe going to deploy its military to protect the U.S. from China, and Tokyo is warning of Taiwan tensions and that sort of stuff. Now, the reason I disagree with this headline, at least in part, because Japan isn't deploying their military or thinking about deploying their military in defense of the U.S. directly. They kind of are. It's more of a defense of U.S. interests, actually, because what they are proposing is rather a deployment of their military to defend Taiwan from China, not the U.S. directly. Now, this is a very good thing in my view. Japan has not had a military since, or an overseas military, since 1945 because of the peace agreement that they reached with America. And in fact, American troops have been in Japan in excess of 50,000, by the way, multiple times more than there are in Afghanistan, and there have been in Afghanistan for years, but we don't consider ourselves at war with Japan, do we? Just something to mention there for all you anti-war people who complain about Afghanistan but don't care about this. Now, Japan has not deployed their military overseas in a long time. Once again, since 1945, they simply haven't. But now they're doing it in defense of Taiwan against China. And considering the amount of time that Japan has away from their imperialist methods back in the 40s, and the amount of things they have done which are eminently valuable to the U.S. and the clear allyship that they have with us, I don't think this sort of thing necessarily needs to stay on. I'm still kind of in favor of American troops still being there and training with the Japanese and doing all of this sort of stuff to keep stability, of course. But it seems to me that this would be a reasonable thing to do. Have regional interests protect other regional interests among all of our allies. Taiwan and Japan are both of our allies, and to help each other defend themselves against China is an entirely reasonable thing to do. I think that's good in this case, though the headline is, once again, a bit misleading. I think, in all likelihood, this has to do with some things going on with regard to the war games. If you remember that story, it was just a few days ago, about a half a week ago, I think it was, where the story came out that the military did war games and was utterly decimated by China in these war games. Now, I thought that story itself was probably a bit dishonest. It's likely a worst-case scenario in which that happens. Of course, it's probably also ignoring things like the massive amount of gun ownership in America and that sort of thing. It's just, I don't know, I don't trust it. It's like models, and, it's like model. It literally is actually a model. That's kind of where I feel about that, and that's kind of what this headline is. And that's it. I'm not trying it to bash OANN, which is where this particular headline came from. It just seems like a bit misleading. All right, moving on, though, to our next bit of a big story here. The Wall Street Journal has put out a report and a complete breakdown of how schools have reopened, and they've been reopened for months, and they're doing a report essentially on how well they've fared and what things have worked, what hasn't, and this story, to begin with, is a bit of a mixed bag. Some of the information here is valuable. Some of the information here is utter worthlessness, and is obviously informed by the biases of the scientists who were doing this report. But let's go through the claims before we get going on the my complaining about some of this study. So, first thing is, they found that essentially the less intrusive stuff were good. Some of these sort of things, and they were saying, oh, people like masks and ventilation. They don't really like to do deep cleans and that sort of stuff. And they made some claims about how we need to de-emphasize things like social distancing and de-emphasize things like deep cleaning because they're not as valuable as things like aerosol spread is. The COVID-19 virus spreading on surfaces or spreading through droplets, as would be affected by potential social distancing or through deep cleaning, is not as important as aerosol droplets. And this is something that is coming into sharper focus over this last few days, because a former FDA, I think commissioner or something like that, was saying that the social distancing mandate wasn't based on clear science, and he said this because the scientists were assuming that it was going to work much like influenza, where it was spreading through droplets. But it turns out that COVID-19 actually spreads through the much more effective and less affected by social distancing method of aerosols, which are much smaller particles, by the way, ones that are much less affected by mess. Who would have thunk? But in this case, it says that the 6-foot distancing requirement was weird and strange and wasn't really exactly what it was supposed to be. And this report also parrots that same claim. Along with that, you also have the sort of claim that all of the other measures are working, things like masking and whatnot. And I have a problem with that one, but we'll get to that. And as well, you also have claims like less than 10%, first of all, and this isn't really a claim, this is just data, 10%, less than 10% of COVID cases in the U.S. are children, which is surprising because that's less than disproportionate. Children make up a much higher percentage of the population than 10%, and it's less than 10%. So children aren't being affected by this as much. And this report also corroborates that exact claim, saying that teachers were actually most of the transmission vector in the actual schools as opposed to students, which is, in all likelihood, correct. However, let's get back to the claim, and let's get to the complaining that I'm going to be having against this study, because the claim that the actual measures like masking and ventilation and that sort of stuff worked, see, you have to understand the context of this particular claim and this particular study, because this study was doing something fairly specific. It wasn't doing what it was necessarily purporting to do in this particular claim. You see, the exact claim that they were making is that they found a lower amount of transmission in schools with mitigation efforts in place than in the general populace. That was about their same claim. I'm not reading it, obviously, so take it with a few different words here and there. I might be a bit off, but it's paraphrased fairly accurately. That's what they claimed. Now, here's the problem. They didn't measure any schools without mitigation efforts. They didn't measure any schools without mask mandates or ventilation or any of those sorts of things that are less intrusive. The actual study, what it was trying to do was differentiate between schools that were doing more normal things like mask mandates and that sort of stuff, and something that was doing what they called an alternative quarantine method. I'm not exactly sure on the details of what that was, but it's not particularly relevant in this case because there were no schools in this case without mitigation efforts. So there's no distinguishing here between different sorts of schools. All schools in this formulation have mitigation efforts. So what you could do, to be more honest, is say that schools that we studied had less transmission than the general populace, which would make sense with what we've already established in this case. Children, as I've already stated, make up a much smaller percentage of COVID cases than they do of the population. And the teachers, as they established in their report, were the major transmission vector as opposed to the students. This suggests that rather than the mitigation efforts doing anything at all, what this has to do with the smaller and lower amount of transmission in schools as compared to the rest of society has to do with the age demographics in the school, not the mitigation efforts, as the mitigation efforts seem to have nothing to do with anything in this case. That is the sort of dishonesty you can get out of many political scientists. And these people, to be clear, are that. They are there to promote particular policies. That's what they're trying to do. That's why they put the language as they did, because they had no control. They weren't measuring the population without mitigation efforts and measuring against the population with mitigation efforts. They were instead measuring a particular place with a particular age demographic, with a particular aversion, actually, and limitation on COVID inherent in its age demographics as compared to the entire populace. There's obviously different variables here than simple mitigation. There's obviously different variables here than the masks. But of course, this doesn't get mentioned in this study because they're dishonest. However, as I said, this is a mixed bag because some of the stuff that's said here is useful. It makes it entirely clear that the things that many people on the right have been saying for months, that teachers or kids aren't at risk, schools should be open because there's not a big issue with COVID in schools, that they've all been right, despite the teachers' unions and many people in the scientific establishment trying to get them shut down for that opinion. It makes it clear that opinion is correct. And to be clear to the YouTube censors, this is stuff from the CDC. This isn't stuff from any sort of non-authoritative, whatever that means, source. It has come from the literal government. Is that good enough for you? Well, it should be. But of course, it may not be. It's just that sort of thing needs to be, well, addressed. So, moving on to our last story and our last headline story in this case. According to Jason Miller, President Trump will be back with his own platform, which, yay. This is good, because Trump, as it turns out, is rich and has a lot of resources to deal with a lot of the problems that social media platforms have to deal with. And if this platform comes through and doesn't have any major issues, it will have an already made person of interest on the platform, that being Donald Trump. And if Donald Trump continues to continuously post on there with all of his takes, it will force every single journalist or any particular sort of person who has an interest in posting constant Trump stories, as it seems to be the case with many journalistic outlets at this point, as they are treading water and preventing themselves in any way possible from layoffs and the utter destruction of their companies. They will all be on this platform. This platform has the potential, at least, to be huge if it works out. Now, am I saying it's going to necessarily work out? I don't know. Do I have a vested interest in it working out? Not really. I personally like Minds most in terms of a social media platform. And yeah, I know there's controversy around that. By the way, stop it. Just stop it. It's not even it's a controversy, in my opinion. Utter nonsense. I don't care. That's my opinion of that. Not even going to mention what the topic was because it doesn't matter. But this particular platform, I'll tell you, I'll be on it. I will be on it as soon as it is, and of course the link will be down in the description once that gets there. And speaking of which, if you like the video, subscribe down below, because that is all for our media coverage. That story doesn't really have a lot of content, though it makes good for a thumbnail, and for shilling the rest of my platforms as well, because no matter where you are, if you found this and you don't really like the platform you found me on, or you have a preferred platform, go look down in the description, because there may be a platform for you down there, with many links down there for my YouTube, BitChute. I actually don't think my YouTube's down there, but my BitChute page, my Odyssey, Brighteon, all of these sorts of places. And of course, we have my Minds, my Parler, and my Gab, where I put up my videos. On Minds particularly, I do also upload there, and I also put my thoughts on Minds. All that sort of stuff I suggest you go check out, and that is where we'll end for Breaking on the Daily. I'm KelKidman, and I'm out.